One of the greatest peacetime spy dramas in the nation's history reaches its climax as Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobel, convicted of revealing atomic secrets to the Russians, enter the federal building in New York to hear their doom.
I left the service some 4 years ago, and I haven't any means of knowing whether words of mine, perhaps lifted from context, perhaps even garbled, as they sometimes have been, wouldn't severely prejudice or damage the government in its conduct of international affairs.
From covert operations to high-stakes espionage, these spies have changed the course of history with their cunning and deception. I'm James Hanson, and today we're ranking the most notorious spies in history, whose daring missions and double lives forever altered world events. So, get ready as we dive into the secrets, betrayals and hidden agendas that defined these infamous figures. Welcome to our countdown of the top 10 most notorious spies of all time. Alright, straight in at number 10 is Virginia Hall. Despite her incredible bravery and effectiveness during World War II, Hall's legacy has been overshadowed by others in popular culture. But her contributions to Allied victory were extraordinary. Let's take a look. Born and raised in the US, after graduating, Virginia Hall used her love of languages and adventure to travel through Europe, eventually working at the US Embassy in Warsaw, in Poland. Her next assignment took her to Turkey, where a serious hunting accident caused her to lose her left leg below the knee. She was fitted with a prosthetic wooden leg, which she referred to as Cuthbert, and would ultimately give rise to the Gestapo's nickname for her, the Limping Lady. Virginia had always dreamed of working in the Foreign Service, but when she applied a few years later after her accident, she was told that only able-bodied people need apply. Undeterred, she was ultimately accepted into the British Special Operations Executive, and she spent 13 months in Vichy, France, between August 1941 and November 1942, organising spy networks, running safe houses and delivering intelligence to the British government. After fleeing France, she joined the US Office for Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, and returned to the country in 1944, again taking up the cause of the resistance. In 1945, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for her heroism during the war, and continued intelligence work for the CIA until her retirement in 1966. Reportedly, the Gestapo considered Virginia Hall to be the most dangerous of all Allied spies, and her legacy lives on through a number of books and films about her remarkable career.
This is Casino Estoril in Portugal. This was the stage of a lot of important spy encounters during the Second World War.
Next up is Dusco Popof, a key double agent during World War II. Popov's work was vital in misdirecting Nazi forces during D-Day, and his daring, flamboyant style reportedly inspired Ian Fleming to create the character of James Bond. Born in 1912 to a wealthy Serbian family, after graduating from Belgrade University, Popov moved to Germany to continue his studies. Whilst he was there, he met friends who would later connect him with Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence unit. Abwehr asked Popov to move to England and spy for them there. Popov accepted, but on arrival in London, he went straight to MI6 and told them everything, becoming a double agent working for the British during World War II. After his training in Italy, he was sent to Portugal to meet with his German spy master, who was living in the beach resort of Estoril. Portugal, being a neutral country during the war, was full of spies who'd mingle alongside each other in bars, hotels and casinos. Popov and his spy master would exchange secret messages using the numbers on the roulette wheel at the Casino Estoril. And one night, whilst enjoying the company of several admiring women, he crossed paths with the British Naval Intelligence Officer Ian Fleming. Fleming never spoke of their encounter, but Popov would later claim he was the inspiration for James Bond, and the Casino Estoril was the inspiration for Casino Royale. Popov certainly had much in common with 007, the same expensive tastes, luxurious lifestyle, and eye for the ladies. His code name was Tricycle because he was the head of a trio of British double agents, although the other theory is that this refers to his penchant for bedding two women at once. His extravagance wasn't always an asset, however. When he tried to report a planned Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover took no notice because he simply didn't believe a man with such a flamboyant lifestyle. Where he did make a difference, however, was in Operation Fortitude, which tried to deceive the Nazis into believing the Allied invasion of Europe would target Calais, not Normandy, thereby diverting hundreds of thousands of German troops and increasing the likelihood of Operation Overlord and D-Day succeeding. Moving on now to a man known as the Ace of Spies and a master of deception. Sidney Reilly's exploits during the early 20th century became legendary. Born the illegitimate son of a Jewish doctor in Ukraine, little is known about Reilly's early life. Even his real name is unclear. Some believe he was born as Georgi Rosenblum, others as Zygmunt Markovich Rosenblum. What we do know is that after studying chemistry in Vienna, he travelled to Brazil, where he made friends with British Army officers in the Amazon and was recommended to British intelligence in London. In 1899, he assumed the identity of Sidney George Reilly and began spying for Britain's secret intelligence service. Over the years, he reported on Russian oil developments in Persia and Baku, the progress of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and Russian naval fortifications in Manchuria. In 1905, as the story goes, he disguised himself as a priest on the French Riviera and persuaded the Persian oil concession holder William Knox Darcy into selling oil concessions to Britain against fierce French competition. Whilst disguised as the manager of a German shipbuilders agency in St. Petersburg, he gained access to Germany's 5-year naval development plan, which he reported to London over 3 years prior to the outbreak of World War I. And on one occasion, by his own account, he ventured behind German lines and attended a general staff meeting in the presence of the Kaiser. In May 1918, Reilly went to Moscow intent on toppling the new Bolshevik regime. But his plans were betrayed and he had to flee. In September 1925, he crossed the Russian border again. British newspapers quickly dubbed him the greatest spy in history and the Scarlet Pimpernel of Red Russia. And like Dusco Popof, he's seen as one of the inspirations for Ian Fleming's 007.
And a former KGB man has warned today that the diplomats left out views Moscow didn't approve of.
Labour politicians often spoke about things which the Russians didn't like human rights, abuses in the Soviet Union, persecution of dissidents, and the war in Afghanistan, and so on.
In at number 7 is the high-ranking KGB officer turned British double agent Alleg Gordi. He played a vital role in Cold War intelligence, providing crucial insights into Soviet strategies before his dramatic defection. Born in Moscow in the 1930s, Gordievsky joined the Soviet Foreign Service in East Berlin, just before the construction of the Berlin Wall. He joined the KGB in 1963 and was posted to the Soviet embassy in Copenhagen. However, as the 60s wore on, Gordievsky became increasingly disillusioned with the USSR. In particular, he was outraged at the brutal crushing of the Prague Spring reform movement in Czechoslovakia. As a result, he started sending covert signals to British and Danish intelligence agencies that he might be willing to cooperate. In 1974, he agreed to pass secrets to MI6 and was given the codename Sunbeam. By the mid-80s, he was station chief for the KGB's London Bureau and was a highly effective double agent for the British. 2 of his most important contributions were averting a potential nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union when the Soviets misinterpreted the NATO exercise Able Archer 83 as a potential first strike, and also identifying Mikhail Gorbachev as the Soviet heir apparent. In 1985, he was suddenly recalled to Moscow. Gordievsky had a very high-stakes decision to make. He could either officially defect to Britain and live secretly under MI6 protection, or he could return to the Soviet Union, but risk death if the KGB suspected his betrayal. Ultimately, Gordievsky chose to return to Russia, but not for long. Once there, MI6 set in motion its escape plan, codenamed Operation Pimlico, which was activated by the secret passing of signals. Gordievsky waited on a particular street corner on a particular weekday at 7:30 in the evening, carrying a Safeway bag as a signal. An MI6 agent walked past carrying a Harrods bag and eating a Mars bar, and the two made eye contact. The mutual signals indicated the escape plan was to be put into immediate action. Gordievsky boarded a train to Leningrad and then travelled to a rendezvous point near the Finnish border. He was met by British embassy cars who managed to smuggle him across the border. And after his escape, the Soviets sentenced him to death in absentia for treason. But his defection caused huge embarrassment for the USSR, and he's continued to live in the UK under protection ever since. Now moving on to 6th place on our list, it's Richard Sorge, whose infiltration of Nazi Germany and Japan during World War II was instrumental in helping the Soviet Union, not to mention that his intelligence on Operation Barbarossa had significant historical impact. Born in modern-day Azerbaijan, Richard Sorge served in the German army during World War I. In 1919, he joined the Communist Party of Germany before visiting Moscow in 1924 and being recruited as a Soviet intelligence officer. Under the cover of being a German journalist, he was sent to various European countries to assess the likelihood of a communist revolution, before travelling to China to organise a spy ring for the Communist International. As part of his cover, he joined the Nazi Party in 1933 and eventually served as a political advisor to the German ambassador for Japan. But it was during World War II that Sorge became most valuable to the Soviets. In May 1941, he reported to the Russians that 170 German divisions would attack along the Soviet frontier just weeks later. Fatefully, Stalin didn't believe him. But when the Nazis did launch Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June, Sorge was proved correct. Then, in August 1941, he reported that the Japanese army was planning to advance southwards against targets in the Pacific rather than northwards against the USSR. This information freed Soviet troops along the Manchurian border for service in the West. In October 1941, he was arrested by the Japanese on suspicion of espionage before being tortured and forced to confess. Stalin chose not to intervene on his behalf, and Sorge was hanged in November 1944. 20 years later, he was officially declared a hero of the Soviet Union. In at number 5 now, femme fatale or unjustly accused. Despite questions about her actual effectiveness as a spy, Mata Hari's execution and the mystique surrounding her have made her one of the most famous spies in history. Born in the Netherlands as Margarita Zeller, Mata Hari was the stage name she used during her career as an exotic dancer, in which she found fame for slowly stripping nude during her act. Because the Dutch were neutral during the First World War, she was able to cross freely across borders, and her catalogue of lovers included high-ranking military personnel from various countries. However, her travel and lifestyle began to attract attention. Before the war, her promiscuous behaviour might only have been met with moral disapproval, but during the war, it led to suspicions of espionage. One of her lovers was Major Arnold Kaller, a German military attaché. Considering her either a nuisance or a liability, he used a code he knew the French had already cracked to identify her as a spy. She was arrested in a luxury Paris hotel in 1917, and her trial took place 5 months later. The prosecution blamed Hari for the deaths of 50,000 French soldiers, though no specific evidence was provided as to how she caused their deaths. Mata Hari was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad. And even though there is some evidence she spied for the Germans and for a time was a double agent for the French, many historians believe she was simply an easy scapegoat for a war-weary France, being seen as an immoral foreigner who shamelessly seduced men from all sides. Whatever the truth, Mata Hari's name has become indelibly associated with the concept of the femme fatale.
The end of the book deals with the treachery of Kim Filby, a Russian spy who worked for MI6 from 1941.
Next up, let's talk about Kim Filby, a key member of the Cambridge Five who deeply infiltrated British intelligence, severely damaging Western operations during the Cold War and altering the course of history by passing key secrets to the USSR. Born in British India and educated at the prestigious Westminster School, Filby became a committed communist while studying at the University of Cambridge. In 1933, he was recruited as a Soviet agent. He worked as a journalist until 1940 when Guy Burgess, a British secret agent who himself was a Soviet double agent, recruited Filby into MI6.
Would you still regard Burgess, who lived with you for a while in Washington, would you still regard him as a friend of yours? How do you feel about him now?
I consider his action deplorable, On the subject of friendship, I prefer to say as little as possible because it's very complicated.
By the end of World War II, Filby was the head of Britain's counter-espionage operations, a hugely sensitive post. During this time, he routinely passed information to his real bosses in Moscow, including details of an Allied plan to send armed anti-communists into Albania, warning Guy Burgess and fellow double agent Donald Maclean that they were under suspicion and sharing secrets about MI6 and the CIA. After Burgess and Maclean defected in 1951, suspicion fell on Filby. He was relieved of his intelligence duties later that year and dismissed by MI6 in 1955. In 1963, he fled to Moscow and eventually reached the rank of colonel in the KGB. A lifelong communist, it seems ideology was the driving motivator for Filby's treasonous behaviour. When he died in 1988, he was given a hero's funeral in Moscow. OK, we're into our top three now and on to another devastating American mole. Robert Hansen spied for the Soviets and Russians for over 2 decades, severely compromising US intelligence operations. Born in Chicago, Hansen joined the police in 1972, becoming a member of a unit that investigated corrupt officers. At the time, he seemed a very unlikely future spy. He was devoutly Catholic, had an awkward demeanour, and was fervently anti-communist. You could say it was the perfect cover. After joining the FBI in 1976, he began working in the Bureau's Soviet Counterintelligence Unit. 3 years later, he approached the Soviet Main Intelligence Directorate, the GRU, to offer his services. Hansen sold details of the FBI's bugging activities and lists of suspected Soviet agents for financial gain. In 1981, his wife discovered his activities, and Hansen promised to stop spying, which he did for a time. But in 1985, he resumed his activities and began to spy for the KGB, selling around 6,000 classified documents, including information that revealed numerous double agents planted in the Soviet Union, at least 3 of whom were subsequently arrested and executed. He also revealed a multi-million-dollar eavesdropping tunnel built by the FBI under the Soviet embassy in Washington. In 1991, Hansen stopped his activities, partly because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and partly because he was aware by this stage that the FBI was hunting for a spy within its ranks. The FBI did eventually flush him out, and he was arrested near his home in Virginia in 2001 after leaving a package of classified materials at a dead drop site. He was charged with selling US intelligence documents to the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia for more than $1.4 million in cash, diamonds and Rolex watches over 22 years. To avoid the death penalty, Hansen pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 15 life terms without the possibility of parole and was imprisoned until his death in 2023. His spying was described by the Department of Justice as possibly the worst intelligence disaster in US history.
Mr. Ames was head of the Soviet counterintelligence branch. In other words, he was in a position to give away not just information, but also names. And it's clear from this that he was apparently working for Moscow, for Boris Yeltsin's Russia, until late last year.
Taking our second spot now is former American intelligence officer Alrig Ames. As one of the most damaging moles in CIA history, Ames's betrayal directly led to the deaths of numerous CIA assets. His case shocked the US intelligence community. Much like Robert Hansen, the discovery of Ames's spying activities sent shockwaves through the American intelligence community. He'd been working for the CIA for 31 years when he was eventually exposed in 1994. Having been spying for the Russians since 1985. At least 10 CIA agents within the Soviet Union were executed as a result of Ames's spying, and ultimately he revealed the name of every American agent operating in the Soviet Union, often by leaving documents at pre-arranged dead drop sites. For his services, Ames was paid $2.7 million, the most money ever paid by the Soviet Union or Russia to any American for spying. In 1993, the FBI became suspicious of Ames's unexplained wealth. He was arrested in 1994 and was ultimately convicted of espionage and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's a sentence he is still serving to this day.
Someone had passed America's atomic bomb secrets to Russia. This was an undisputed fact that the whole world knew. The federal government had laid the crime at the doorstep of 2 native New Yorkers, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg.
All right, taking first place in our list is married couple Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Their case is one of the most infamous in American history. Their execution during the Cold War for passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union was a global scandal and remains highly controversial. By most accounts, Julius Rosenberg was an enthusiastic communist. His job at the Army Signal Corps engineering labs made him an enticing recruit for Soviet spies who approached him in 1942. In 1944, he started recruiting for the Russians and personally oversaw the activities of several Soviet spies, including the one who would ultimately cause his own downfall, his brother-in-law, David Greenglass, who had been working on the Manhattan Project. When Greenglass was arrested in 1950, he named his wife as a co-conspirator along with Julius. He originally denied his sister Ethel was also involved, but later changed his story. Soon after, the FBI raided the Rosenbergs' home and arrested Julius. Ethel was later arrested herself, leaving a federal courthouse in New York, having testified that she had no knowledge of her husband's spying. Greenglass later told the New York Times that he'd cut a deal with the government, implicating his sister in return for his wife's immunity. Sentencing guidelines gave the judge two choices for Julius and Ethel: 30 years imprisonment or death. The judge decided both of them should be executed, and they were killed by electric shock at Sing Sing Prison in New York in 1953.
The electric chair awaited the two convicted spies as the hour of their final reckoning approached, and then it was over. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had paid their debt to society with their lives. For the first time in its 177-year history, a United States civil court had decreed and followed through on the execution of two native-born Americans on the charge of espionage.
There are several reasons why the Rosenbergs' case remains so controversial. Firstly, whilst it's almost certain that Julius was guilty, Ethel's involvement seems much less clear. Furthermore, the case was exposed during the height of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and many feel the sentences passed down spoke more to the anti-communist paranoia of the era than the severity of the Rosenbergs' crimes. And then there's the fact that while Julius and Ethel were sentenced to death, David Greenglass was given just 15 years in prison, serving just over 9. The Rosenberg sons have always maintained their innocence, and the case remains one of the most controversial in American history. Well, there we have it. That wraps up our list of the top 10 most notorious spies that ever lived. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.